Good afternoon for the last day of build stuff, or I guess it's the middle day. I'm doing a workshop tomorrow, so still have 2 more days to go here. So my name is Jimmy Bogard. You can find me on Twitter at @jbogard. My GitHub, where I have all my slides and presentations and all my code, is at github.com/jbogard. And finally, I blog somewhat regularly on jimmybogard.com. For my actual real day job, I work for a small consulting company out of Texas called Headspring, where the projects I'll be talking about today, I built as part of the team there. I used to blog a whole lot on a separate site, so you may have read my stuff on Los Techies. I do a bit of open source, and actually some of the open source projects that I work on came out of the projects I'm talking about. Most people know me for their love or hate, I get that a lot too, of AutoMapper and some other projects as well. And finally, I get an award for, I have no idea why, but I just get the award every year and I get free stuff. So I get a Microsoft MVP award, yay. So this is the DDD do-over. By the way, the DDD stands for domain-driven design. If you didn't expect domain-driven design, it's okay to walk out now, that's fine. But it's domain-driven design. And this is a do-over project, not a rewrite, because that's bad, right? We don't do rewrites. This is the story of 2 projects in nearly the identical domain, set about 3 or 4 years apart with my time at Headspring, in which we got to make all the mistakes that everyone makes with domain-driven design with the first project, and then got to fix those mistakes in the second project. So this is the story of the mistakes we made in the first round and how we fixed everything and improved on things in the second project. Not an opportunity that I know that a lot of people get to basically do the same project, almost the exact same project twice without it being a rewrite, but this is one of those opportunities. I will say though, both of these projects did go to production, including the first one that I didn't consider quite as successful, but success is always if we go to production, so if we release production, it's still a success. So, part 1, the Majestic Monolith. Does this term mean anything to anyone? The Majestic Monolith. So this was a term coined as an answer or a counter-argument to the microservices movement from the creator and maintainer of Ruby on Rails. And he said that, okay, all this microservice business is actually just a load of junk. Just build everything as one really big application and everything will be okay. And so that's what we did in the first round, is build this Majestic monolith. I will say that we were contracted to do so, and this is one of the hard lessons we had is there's only so many things you can negotiate after the project starts, but when the contract literally says you have to build a single app, then there's not a lot you can do. So we were contracted to build a single application. And just some background here, this was for the counties in the state of Texas, counties being local governments in the state of Texas. The main contractor was this group over here, the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. Now, one thing that this application was about was if a kid gets in trouble, that is someone that's not of the adult age, I think which is 18 in Texas, if they're not an adult and they get in trouble, they do something bad, then they don't go through the normal sort of legal process, they go through a special legal process for kids. And so this project, normally in the state of Texas, every single municipality has their own individual IT budget. And in Texas, there are about 250 to 260 of these individual counties, each having their own budget. And so this project was intended to pool all those different resources together to build a single system for the entire state of Texas. Now this project was also the very first Agile project for any Texas government agency. So that also meant that we had Scrum literally written to our contract, which I also don't recommend. Don't put Scrum in your contract. You will not have a good time. This is also the very first domain-driven design project that we knew about for any Texas government agency. Most of the existing systems in the state of Texas were these lovely high contrast green and black applications that have all the function keys with millions of lines of COBOL that everyone knows and loves. So this was trying to buck that trend and build a system that people actually could enjoy using and not just complain about it all the time. Now the previous systems that existed out there, because every single county had their own individual budget, that means that every single county built their own individual system. So because the budget was based on the size of the county and the number of people that lived there, that meant that some of the counties could afford to build their own individual systems. So large cities like Dallas, which has something like 4 million people or something like that in the entire area there, they had their own system. Right next door, literally like probably 50 kilometers away, was another city, Fort Worth, who had their own system. Houston, of course, another very large city, the fourth largest in the United States, had their own system, and so on and so on. So most of the large cities in Texas had their own individual system, and none of these looked anything like each other whatsoever. Because they were able to just build it completely from scratch, however they wanted to, none of these looked like the same application. They didn't behave the same, and more importantly, none of these systems talked to each other. So, because of this, we would one of the main motivations behind it was to try to build a system in which we could share information between these different counties. Now, if you were in one of these very large cities with a lot of people, then the Texas Juvenile Justice Department built a very simple, of course, Microsoft Access, because why not, application for everybody else. And everybody else could be a county with literally like 1,000 people in it. Some of these counties are very small, and some of them are a little bit larger. So that system was meant to be just for absolutely everybody else. And so what we were going to do, this was our grand vision, was to replace all of these systems, and of course, each box is not represented by one application, but potentially 1 to a dozen in some cases, with a new system where everyone came to this one single system to do the juvenile case management. And of course, we like acronyms in government, so is the JCMS system. The S was redundant. We always call it JCMS system. S stand for system. Oh well. So, there were some overarching kind of high-level goals that were a part of this system, and some of these led into why we built the monolith in the first place. The first one was to increase knowledge sharing between the different counties. Now, as part of our initial phase of the process, we would go out and actually talk to the people that were dealing with juveniles in the state of Texas. And one of the big problems that they ran into was if a kid gets in trouble in one city and he moves for whatever reason to another city, there's no information or knowledge sharing between those two counties. So they don't know that they already got in trouble over here. They don't know that these programs work for the kid and these programs didn't. They also didn't know that they had a potentially abusive relationship with their uncle that they were moving to. These kind of things they didn't know about because none of these systems talk to each other. So when we were talking with to the people that we're building the system for, one of the big goals was we want to make sure that kids don't get in trouble, that if something happens where they do get in trouble, that they have the programs in place to put them on the right path in life. And they were very, very, very passionate about this subject. The other thing they wanted to do was to have a single system that covered every single aspect of the juvenile process. So not just a system that dealt with when they got in trouble and they had to go to jail. Oh, no, they didn't call it jail. They had kind of softer words, so they called it detention, not jail. And then all the way to process through the legal process, and then all the way through potentially going to courts and after that as well. So they wanted to have one system that not only replaced all the systems from each individual county, but for one given county, replace all the systems that they had there. So you can probably tell we're trying to please a lot of different people here and how well that's going to go. And of course, they want to have that one single complete picture of the juvenile, so they knew the entire history of what happens with the kid, so that if something happens in the future, they have all the available information to get that kid on the right path. Now, it may surprise you that the legal process in Texas is complicated. Maybe not. This is the legal process simplified for the state of Texas. This is a poster that was on the wall of one of our clients, and it literally went from the floor to the ceiling, probably about 3 meters high or so. So they can come up and say, oh yeah, right, when this happens, it goes over here, whatever. Now, we didn't build all of this process. You may notice that there's, at the bottom here, it's small because it's such a very detailed picture. Down here at the bottom is where the juvenile process is. So once they figure out that this person that got arrested is a juvenile, then they come to the lower part, and then this process down here kicks in for them. So we were only building about a third, I guess, of the picture that you see up here. Now, in a new Agile project, what is the very first thing you have to do? You have to build user stories, right? And one of the key parts of a user story is that user persona. So we went out to all the different counties, talking to them, interviewing them to figure out, okay, what are these different personas that should exist for a system? Because I have to build out these user stories, right? As a something, I want to something so that something. Like as a developer, I want to choke myself so that I don't have to write these stupid story templates ever again. So we had to figure out who these as a blank, all these user personas were going to be. So we started on the path of asking, okay, who are all the different kinds of people that were going to be using the system? And we had to come up with cute, clever names, so everything started with the same letter. So it'd be the Matt, the mental health practitioner. We'd have Pete, the probation officer. Larry, the law enforcement officer. Larry was kind of jerk. Don't bother him unless he's had his coffee. Nancy, nurse. Judy, judge, because of course. Ivan, the institutions officer, Andy, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. So yeah, there were a lot of, over there, Patty, probation officer with disposition privileges. That's just a mouthful there. So yeah, we started, once we kept going down this path, we were like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of different people using this system. So this is where the cracks were already starting to show in our one single system to try to please everyone approach. We had about 72 personas. Now, because we were an agile project, you have to have everything as a card in a conversation. And so these were all represented as giant Post-it notes, which they make pretty large sizes, that we'd paste on the wall so we could go stare at them like, yes, let's think about what Pete the probation officer is doing today. And we'd all gather around that wall. So we put all of these on the wall. It was a little difficult to fit all these and even understand who was who and what they were doing. So we started to color code them based on the different agencies they were working with. So that was our very first lesson in the domain-driven design journey, that yes, bounded contexts actually are a thing. In fact, we should really have thought about that when we were going in. On the screenshot on the right, I have the view of a juvenile, and that menu, it gets a little bit cut off because there's so many different items, but each of those menu items represents a different agency or subgroup in the state of Texas that is completely separate from the others. So I think in that, we have about 20 to 25 different high-level groups. Now, it can be difficult to build a system that pleases all these people, and so we couldn't. So the main people that we focused with and the main people that we're building the system for were actually just one of those menu items and nobody else, the probation officers. Because the probation officers are the ones that try to help the kid get out of any more trouble in the future, and they were the most passionate about this, so they were the ones that we were mainly dealing with, just one of those menu items. So that meant that one of those menu items was like really awesome, and everything else kind of sucked. Because we didn't know what the other people were doing on a daily basis, because everything was going through, just talking through those one group of people. This also meant that when you have one system trying to deal with all these different people, that it can be difficult just to have normal modeling discussions. So we had something, a lot of different objects in our system that had very ambiguous names. And this was another key indicator that we did something wrong, is when we have something like a person object or a person table in our system. Does anyone have one of those in their systems? Like person? Yes. It doesn't mean anything to anyone, but it was the least common denominator of all the different things we were looking at. So that person was represented in that one single place. But if we actually talked to any given group that was using the system, they never used the term person, because that doesn't have any sort of legal meaning in the process, but it just represented a human, so that's what we had to do. This also presented other problems, because one of the other big goals is no data duplication. Even though they didn't really understand what that would imply over time, that meant that if I had a person coming into the system, they would only be in that system exactly once, and that's it. Because we can't duplicate that data over time. So that meant that this person object, of course, became the trap and the place that we put any kind of information related to this person, and so it just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew to a very, very wide table. And the other major problem we had is, well, a kid is a person, right? That makes logical sense. So a juvenile is actually also represented as a person in the system. But this meant that the system prevented us from modeling the exact situation in which the system was designed to enable. The example being, let's say I'm a kid, I get in trouble. My probation officer gets me some counseling that I need. Maybe he gets me in the right schooling programs, things like that. It really takes off and it really takes hold for me. And so I stop getting in trouble and I go on a good path. I go on to university. And in university, I realized that, you know what? I want to help out kids the exact way that I was helped out. So I'm going to become a lawyer in which I can now help kids out in the future. So this person goes on to law school, gets their degree, and starts work and gets their very first case, but there's a problem. When they sign up to use the system, they're already a kid, a juvenile in the system. So they won't actually be able to be represented in the system because it says, I'm sorry, we can't have adults use this, or we can't have kids use the system. You're an adult now, so you're not allowed to use this anymore. And in fact, when other people would see their information like, wait a minute, you also got in trouble? We didn't know that. But now everything is represented to this one single object. So the very situation that we were trying to enable was presented with this very ambiguous modeling. So that was our second major lesson here. When we're trying to drive towards a ubiquitous language that everyone shares, it should actually be ubiquitous with everyone that uses the system. If there's something that no one actually agrees upon about what that means, or just so generic because that's the only commonality, then it's not actually something ubiquitous, and it really should be at least more than one model. This started to become even more clear when we were talking to the different agencies using the system to try to figure out what was the most important thing that they were going to be dealing with. So when we talked to the law enforcement agency, said, okay, what is the most important thing that you do on a daily basis? And see how that relates to the system we're building. Well, for them, it's all about offenses, someone committing a crime, allegedly, and then arresting for that alleged crime, hopefully not getting too roughed up in the process because it's Texas and these things kind of happen sometimes. And so that was, for them, the most important thing that was happening. We talked to the courts people, and they said for them, the trial is the very most important thing. The prosecutors, on a daily basis, all they deal with is cases. And finally, the juvenile probation department, for them, it was actually all about the kids. So that was our next big lesson here, is that when we're looking at what is the core purpose of the system, the people using it should agree about what that core purpose is. And so not only should the language that we're using be ubiquitous, but the core domain, the core purpose of what we're trying to build should have some consensus about what we're trying to do. So ignoring the problems of having an ambiguous name, something like person, there were times where we actually had all the different people using the system using the exact same word. Now, when we actually went to talk to the people what that word meant to them, that's when we noticed even more cracks in this process. So we talked to every single group who used the term offense every single day. They said, okay, so what does an offense mean to you? How should we model this in their system? Well, for the law enforcement officers, an offense was literally a triplicate form they filled out. Because this is like half the work that police officers actually do is paperwork. In fact, if you look at police shows and not doing paperwork for half the time, it's not a realistic police show. And so for them, an offense was, this is literally the form CR-23J to be filled out in triplicate. And they had to press really hard to make sure it went all the way through. And they would get one copy, the prosecutors would get one copy, and the courts would get another copy of that one single form. When we talked to the courts about what an offense is, an offense was a little strange because they said, an offense is not something by itself, it's part of a legal process. So for them, it's something to adjudicate and to get a disposition or an outcome of. The prosecutors, although they didn't like to say so, they were all about like charging and making sure that the guilty party was paid the price for their crime. So for them, an offense was something to charge for, and for the probation department, an offense was something to move past and get past and make sure the kid gets on the right path and like, oh, it's okay, don't do that anymore, and hopefully you can get on the right path again. So even when we had everyone using the exact same word, no one agreed about what that word actually meant for them. So this was our fourth lesson, is that the ubiquitous language actually needs consensus about what that word means amongst everyone. It's not good enough that everyone uses the same word. They have to use the same word for the same reasons and the same meanings. And if they don't use the same words for the same reasons, then we're going to have quite a bit of confusion going on. Now, the last lesson we had was around the actual code part of the application. Now, this was in the last decade. In the domain-driven design community, there was endless arguments and discussions about the structural patterns of domain-driven design. How should we build our entities? How should we build our repositories? How should we do this and do that? And we thought we were doing a lot better than we were doing before, which was in a traditional in-tier architecture application, we had the UI layer, the business logic layer, the data access layer, and finally the database. And we greatly improved upon this structure with a DDD style in-tier, where we replaced the business logic layer with domain objects, right? Huge improvement. And finally, the data access layer with our repository. Again, a huge improvement as we had before. And I remember these long, drawn-out discussions of, okay, what is the best way to build a repository? Because, excuse me, there were a lot of different competing patterns out there, and we didn't know exactly the way to go. And the two main patterns we saw out there were the generic repository and the specific repository. The generic repository was some kind of generic object, so you had something like iRepository of T, where the T was going to be some kind of domain object type, and you'd only have one of these implementations, and you'd be able to plug in the domain object for the implementation, and be able to get those abstracted away data access methods. Or you may have a specific repository where you have like iFoo repository, where you have built a very specific domain gate or a data access gateway for your repository against the database. We did both, where we had, and I wrote this, so I can't complain about anything except to myself. Where we did both the specific and the generic repository, and this was the place and where we put all the different kind of data access methods as part of this. You can't see the rest of it. You may notice that there's no end curly brace because the rest of the interface ends like 2 meters below the stage here, somewhere down there. And this is where we put all the encapsulated different methods. And of course, we had to do an in-tier style architecture, so this was in a completely separate project from the implementation. And then those are plugged together with yet another project, and then some kind of compilation, Xcopy magic brought everything together in this sort of mess here. So that was our fifth lesson. Was the structural patterns were the very least important part of domain-driven design. And as a corollary to that, layers are for cakes, not for systems. The structural patterns being how to build entities and aggregates and repositories, things like that. Even though it was the sort of first part of the book, it's not the very most important parts of that book. In fact, Eric Evans, in a talk he did where it was something like domain-driven design 10 years later, said that if he had to do it over again, if he had to write the book over again, he would have taken all that discussion about entities and aggregates and value objects and repositories, removed it, stuck it at the end, at most as an appendix, and maybe just taken out of the book entirely. Because way too much time and effort was spent on the structural parts versus the actual important part of the system. So, the final tally of this application. We had 195 controllers. This is an MVC application. 652 individual actions. 121 different roles. I said 72 earlier, but that actually grew over time to 121 different roles in the system. 218 entities, 184 value objects, 352 enumerations, and a partridge and a pear tree. And finally, 50 counties deployed. And that's what's the success part. We did go to production. We did deploy this application out. Now, this was in the very early days of ASP.NET MVC, the first one. And so when we were building this application, we were very proud of how big it was. We actually invited Microsoft in to show them the different things we had done. And by the way, you should never be proud of how big a system is. That's not something to be proud of exactly. So I met some people with larger, more things that they're going on in this, and some with less. But definitely something like this is just far too large for any one thing. So the myth that we were told of the Majestic monolith looks something like this. There was a beautiful, clean city where everyone's driving like futuristic rocket cars or something like that, and everything's green and happy, and there's no pollution, and everyone just gets along nicely. But the reality looked more like this, where it was a ramshackle town of duct tape and baling wire tying everything together to something that functions, I guess. So like people can live and work here, but it's definitely not the ideal. So after we put that system in production, we were no longer contracted with the company, and so I was going on and doing very, very different things. But a few years after we finished with the system, we got another call from that same company that we were contracted with and said, hey, we want you to come over and do now the adult system for us. And we thought that was interesting because we had actually lost the original bid for the adult system, so we were like pleasantly surprised, like, oh, okay, something must have gone wrong. So this next part is all about our do-over. Now, I say do-over because it wasn't a rewrite of the existing system. We were building the adult portion as opposed to the juvenile portion. So nearly the same identical domain, some different rules or whatnot, but we had a fresh, clean slate to work with. We said we can fix now all the mistakes we did with the previous application. Now some background on this one. I said we lost the bid for the adult project, which was true, but that project eventually didn't succeed, and so with the money left over, they decided they were going to just focus on one individual agency and then just do that one agency at a time. So just kind of by happy accident, we decided to focus on one single agency. If they'd come to us insisting on one big system, there would have been a lot of pushback there. So we just kind of got lucky that the project didn't succeed before, so we were just able to do one project one agency at a time. And we were going to start with the prosecution department. So back to our original picture here, that meant that the system we're going to build was just going to be this one individual box. And by the way, this is another clue to us. If your clients are color coding things with very hard divisions between different steps, maybe you should build a system that actually represents that kind of division here. Hindsight, 2020, all that stuff. So this new system will be built around bounded contexts. So we'd have that prosecution system, but when we went to go talk to the prosecutors, and just them, they used a lot of different language and terminology than any other user of the first system. So yes, other people knew about the major things the prosecution department did, so they knew there were cases, right? We know about cases because we watch television shows about courts. So yes, we know that there are cases, these are these things, but there were a lot of other things that the other groups didn't know about. They didn't know about dockets, and dockets are how prosecutors schedule individual cases. They didn't know about the entire grand jury process, which is this very weird thing in the state of Texas of how we decide if a case should go to court or not, go to trial. And of course, we had some workflow because every single prosecution department did things slightly differently. So from the outside world, they knew that vaguely, yes, there were cases, but once they get inside of the prosecution department, we saw that in reality, there was a lot of more complication going on that really didn't exist outside of their individual agency. So we knew, we put this little wall around, I shouldn't say that in Texas, because I think we're actually going to build that stupid wall. So we built a wall, if you will, around this one single system, and anyone else that needed to use this system, we'd build very individualized applications or portals or something to fit their needs. So the law enforcement agency would have something different they would use that wasn't the system that we built. The defense attorneys would also use something else. And then courts and indigent defense, which are, if you can't afford a lawyer, then you get appointed one of these things. You would have a different system for them. So, this is before we understood really how far off our original design was. So in the very early phases here, we went to go talk to actual prosecutors to see what they do on a daily basis. And I do this with all my projects. I will actually physically go to wherever they are to see how they actually do whatever they're doing on a daily basis. So we were really excited, like we can finally talk to actual users of the original system. So we had our first meeting set up in a nice, of course, posh boardroom. And we said, yes, by the way, you're in good hands with us because we built the previous system, the juvenile system. And the lead attorney stops and gives us this look and says, what? That piece of, well, he didn't use an emoji, but he didn't say crap either. Yeah, he said, oh, that piece of shit. We're like, huh. That is not the reaction I was expecting to hear when we were so very proud of what we built, and the very first thing we hear out of our client's mouth is literally cursing at us about the previous system. So why did they hate the previous system? Well, it wasn't built for them. We built that system for a single set of users and then tried to apply their model to everybody else. The main users in the previous one being the probation officers who are trying to get the kid on the right path. But that's not the goal of a prosecutor. The goal of the prosecutor is not to help the kid, it's to prosecute the kid. Now, I know that seems a little harsh, but we have to remember that when we're talking with these people, they have very real experiences in their mind when they're talking about how they want the system to work. So they told us just horribly awful stories about things that actually happened and came through the system. So we'd see some weird edge case, and then they knew, like, oh, that's this case from 1987 where, like, some axe murder or something. It was just like, oh, okay, I'm kind of sorry I asked the question about that. But they had all these really real experiences in mind that were very, very different from the experiences of the probation department. So it was a bit natural that a system built to help and not have things go to trial would not work, and they would not like that system that is directly opposite of their goals. So the new system, I know it's ugly, but this is their fault. They didn't want it to look nice. I'm sorry. The new system was very case-centric. The previous system was all about the juvenile. The prosecutors, as we saw earlier, they're all about the case and taking the case to trial. So it looks like, in this case, I got in trouble because, what does it say? I burgled a rail car. That is a crime in the state of Texas. Don't do that. We used to actually do, we thought were funnier, sample data, things like Bart Simpson murdered Marge Simpson and then did something else with Lisa Simpson and then killed Homer Simpson as well. And we thought it was all funny when we do our demos. But then they would be reminded of an actual case where something like happened, and then the demo got really awkward really fast. So everything in our system was basically burglary of a rail car because no one had any bad stories about that. So that's what this is all about. But when you land in the system, everything is driven about the case because the case is what they're doing on a very daily basis. So that was our first lesson with the new system. Then we have a very cohesive system that brings additional clarity and insight that we wouldn't have had before. The previous system for the prosecutors was entirely CRUD based. So everything was just edit this, edit that, save that. But when we were able to build a system just for them and just for their needs, we realized that by having some constraints, we could iterate on those constraints and build an even richer system. Originally, it seemed like we were kind of boxing us in by saying, we really didn't build a very comprehensive system, but the reality was the more we constrain things, the more targeted and focused it could be, the better the end result. And this is why Slack should not have threads. Now, one of the other things we had in the first system was some rigidity that we didn't realize that we were baking in. So all those individual individual personas that we had in the system were actually modeled as hard-coded roles in the application. So that Nancy, the nurse, actually exists as a named role entity in our system. And again, don't pick cute names because those can live forever. So the previous system hard-coded all these different roles because we were trying to direct the way every single person should work in the application. So we kind of hard-coded what every single person can do. So that makes a lot of sense in a county like a city like Dallas, where they have maybe 200 or 300 people using this one system. So there's a lot of different things going on. But for small counties in the state of Texas, their probation department and their probation system is Joe. Is that one person. And so this one person would have to be assigned like 50 roles in order to actually use the application. So in the new system, we had to strike a balance to say, well, we wanted to have some knowledge of how it should work, but we know that some counties are different than others. So how can we model this effectively? What we wound up doing is modeling roles and security with some hard-to-code information in some places and some not in others. So in this case, it was sort of a normal one-to-many users and roles. A user belongs to one-to-many roles, and then a role can have one-to-many permissions. Now, the big difference we had here for the previous system, the roles were hard-coded. In this system, the roles were not. However, we still made the permissions hard-coded in the system. The permissions we made were very granular and task-based. So instead of doing role-based authorization, we did permission-based authorization. And so you went to go view an individual page, see a link, see a button. We would check to see, do you have permission to perform that action? Now, some of the actions were somewhat generic, things like edit a charge or change a charge. Some of the things were very, very specific, things like flag as private. That was a special permission for a case where they could apply a flag to it, which meant that case could be seen by no one else, except the people working on the case. Which is important in the state of Texas because sometimes we have football athletes that get in trouble and details can leak to the public. And so by flagging that as private, we made sure that some football player that gets in trouble, no one else finds out about it without changing money, I guess. So the other way that it was kept private. And then we took these permissions and then associated them to every single action in our application. And the nice thing about this is because we knew exactly all the different permissions in the system, we could apply a rule once, like the permission to perform this activity is placed on that one action in the system. So this is a controller with a set of actions. We would decorate that one action with this one permission, and then all of the behavior in the system around dealing with that permission fed off this one individual location. So enforcing the permission was done based on looking at this value here. And then if I wanted to show a link or not was driven off of looking at this value as well. So by representing that concept in one single place, by having some known information versus some dynamic information, we're able to build something that was flexible in places that it needed to be, but rigid in others that we could drive a lot of behaviors around. If we made things too dynamic, that is, permissions were editable and you can add them and whatnot, we couldn't have driven all of the behaviors as easily as we could have. Now, part of our walkthrough of going through all the different counties, we want to see what were the main issues, what were the main problems that they were running into with their previous systems they were working with. Interestingly enough, the two cities that lived only 50 kilometers apart but still had about several million residents each, they both had the exact same problem, the file management problem. One of the counties and cities, I think that was Fort Worth, they had a very advanced IT department. They put a lot of money into their IT to make it a very first-class citizen in their county. And so for them, the file management problem was dealing with all of the digital media evidence that would come in. So if you got in trouble and then there was a dash cam on the car or one of those body cameras or CCTV, and as long as the dash cam and the body cam wasn't accidentally turned off during the arrest, then we would have that evidence to be able to be pulled in. But that evidence has to be kept around for a very long time. The state of Texas laws are something like 25 or 30 years that file has to be stored. And so we had to know what file formats are good 20 years from now. But this is the kind of things I had to deal with. And then having to just physically store all this data in an accessible format, in these very raw format, because they weren't allowed to compress any of that information either. So for them, the file management problem was just dealing with all of this data they had to deal with and all the laws and restrictions around that data itself. So we made the short drive. 50 kilometers over, about an hour and a half, or not about an hour, I guess. We had to stop along the way to get a burger, probably. And then made it all the way over to the other client and says, okay, what is the big problem that you're dealing with on a daily basis? File management. Like, oh, that's funny. We just heard that from just an hour away. That's really interesting. Can you show me your file management problem? Sure, it's right up there. A leak in the ceiling was dripping water onto their paper files and ruining them. When we were walking through the office, we could never just walk side by side. We had to go sideways. We had to duck around like this because all their physical files, all their files were actually physical copies. They had boxes everywhere. They used to store those boxes in the basement, but it does flood in Texas, as it turns out, and so it ruined about 3 years of case files. And you may see this in stories sometimes, like blah, 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 something happened and it ruined all these cases. Like, why would you store those files in the basement where it can flood? Well, otherwise, it's just in the hallways, and so they're always going around trying to navigate all these different files. It's an absolute maze. The other problem they would run into is that file was literally the only record of that case in existence. And so there was no backups or anything like that. Like the case, that was it. If you lost the case, physically, if you lost it, misplaced it, you lost the case in trial as well. And it was really awkward because they'd go to trial case number blah, 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 and I'm sorry, we lost the case. We can't find it. And so they'd have these panic sessions, and I was there for one of them, where someone lost a case, right? They lost a case, and the entire office would stop. And everyone would be looking around trying to find this case to see where that file folder was. The entire operation completely came to a grinding halt because they could not lose a case. How embarrassing. And of course, inevitably, it was I forgot I took it home. Oh, it's in my briefcase. I left it in the bathroom. Gross. And so we just couldn't. It was the 21st century, and the major problem is they were literally losing their cases. So we had to build a system for both of these kinds of problems. And I said earlier that, okay, trying to build a system for every single part of the legal aspect in the state of Texas, yes, that's silly. But even when I get down to the individual prosecution departments, I see, oh my gosh, the way they work, how they operate is completely different. And we asked them, like, why don't you work like everybody else? How come everyone is different? But the reality is that in the state of Texas, they only have some guidelines about the very legal aspects of how to try a case and how it should work. But in terms of the internal organization, there's no guidance, there's no rules, you just do whatever you want. So every single agency, over decades and over the century, just did things however they wanted to do. So it got to the end point where they had the same problem with two completely different actual root problems here. So we had to build a system to satisfy both of these kinds of things and the workflows and the daily work that they would be doing. Now, this is one of our first customers that used Jira on a daily basis. And by the way, beware the product owner that uses Jira. They want your system to be Jira. We found that out very quickly. We said, no, we're not going to build Jira. We know we have to model workflows to handle these two very different kind of scenarios, but I mean, Jira took Atlassian, I don't know, hundreds of developers and millions of man hours. Who knows how much it took? So we're not going to build that. So we started with the very simplest thing that could possibly work. We know we need workflows to handle these two scenarios, but what is the simplest possible thing that could work? So we started with just a very simple state machine that had a workflow status or a state. We tried very hard to have state and transition, but they wanted workflow status. They like things more verbose in the government, so that's what we did. And so the very basic information you need is, I am a workflow for some thing, so that's the entity type, and what is the name of that current status? Then we got to start to layer on top of that transitions between one state to the next. So what is the current state that this represents, and what is the next state? So just that arrow between two different states. We'd have some, at first we just had name as part of it, so what's the name of this transition? We also wanted to include logging information, so we would say, what is the name we're going to show on the screen? And then after this happens, how are we going to represent that information as an event that occurred? And so we had event name, and eventually we wanted to have some ordering because Jira lets you do that, so it said, okay, fine, we'll include some order information. So we built this, and just this. This is just the very basic sort of workflow, and then we would have parts of the system that would know how to take things from one transition to the next, and they were happy with that. Until they realized that, we actually want to put a few restrictions on here, because if I'm approving a case to go to court, to go to trial, that's a very important decision. We don't want just like a law clerk to do that. So I said, okay. We'll just add the very bare minimum to this model to allow that to happen. So we added some roles associated with this. So not only do we have a workflow state and transition, but also who can actually perform this transition, who can perform this action. So we included that as part of this different roles. Now the thing that we tried not to give into, but we just couldn't quite get there, was some counties wanted custom screens for individual transitions because everyone wants that level of customization. But again, we didn't want to build SharePoint because, again, it's SharePoint, it's horrible. So we said, what is the very bare minimum we can need? So we wound up modeling actions as an individual thing in the system. They would tell us, for this individual transition, go to this one screen, and for that one screen, for that one client, they're going to pay for it, and it gets incorporated in the system. So with this somewhat basic model that we built one piece at a time, growing only when necessary, we were able to build some very powerful interactions for the end user. With the previous system, the way the users used it, they would have to search for everything. So once a case got into the system, they would have to remember, what is the case number I'm dealing with? But in the new system, we're able to say, you know what? How about we build screens around what cases are in what individual statuses? And because these statuses are dynamic, we would have the actual list of things be dynamic as well. So we drove work the users used around these different queues. And this was another piece of Jira sort of leaking into our process, because you can define these custom views. So it was a lot of negotiation, again, not build Jira, but this was the kind of thing that they wanted to deal with. Show me all the cases that are ready to file. Show me all the cases that are waiting on lab-bond, whatever that means. Show me the ones with an offer, without an offer, and prosecutor, no bill. I don't know what that means either. They knew what all this meant, though. and driving the work they actually did via just queues of cases, because that's how they worked on a daily basis. Every single prosecutor had a stack of cases on their desk that they start from the top and go to the bottom. So we said, why don't we just represent your actual real-world work as the system we're going to build here? But if we went in the previous system, we were just focused on the basic entities and aggregates in the system, the data they were saying, the data that they were saving and persisting to the database. But in this one, this doesn't actually exist from any of the pieces of paper they have. It's around the work we have. And so that was our third lesson here, was sometimes the model is a step up from the model we're actually dealing with. That the work you have is that swivel chair integration that's actually the process around the information that they're dealing with. And so we said we wanted to build that level of modeling also in our system to have the best possible outcome. Now, I ended the last section with the structural mess of all the different patterns in domain-driven design. So I made a kind of a bold decision when I started this new project. I said we were not going to add any layers or any patterns until the code actually tells us we need them, which is kind of an obvious thing to do, right? Don't over-engineer. But for so long, we had this dogma of like, you must build systems with this tiered architecture and this very layered approach, and that's the way to success. And I see other communities take that even further, Angular, and it just becomes an awful mess over time. So we said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to not have any of those pieces in our system, and I'm going to make it as absolutely simple as possible, and then I'll wait. I'll wait 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months. I'll then take a step back and say, okay, what are the actual patterns emerging in the system? So the very first step to sanity was to collapse all those different layers in the system so that we literally had everything in the controller actions. I know you're not supposed to do that, but that was the only way we could not fool ourselves or trick ourselves and say, you know what, just do the stupidest thing possible, the most procedural, dumbest code. Let's just start with that and then see what things actually emerge. So what emerged? We took a step back after about 2 or 3 months to see what are the overall things going on in our system. When we took a step back, we see that there were 2 main kinds of things going on in our system that were, because it's a web application, there were GET requests to get data, which was a safe idempotent because I needed to have a fancy word here, and posts were non-safe because they were changing data and then not idempotent. So we looked at this and said, you know what, actually that's 2 things that people are talking about a lot now because CQRS was starting to become a thing, which was queries and commands. So rather than focusing our application around the entities, we started to focus around what are the actual actions, the operations you're doing. Well, there's queries where you're getting data and commands that you're changing data. And what if we built our system around these concepts as opposed to the structural concepts earlier? Now, I went through many different iterations of this approach where we had query objects and command objects. We eventually set around that queries and commands are both just forms of requests. So we modeled everything in our system as a series of request handlers, where there was some input representing a unique request to either get some information or do an action, something that handles the requests, and then finally, some potential output. The output could even be success or failure. Yes, this command succeeded, or no, it didn't succeed. Or for a query, the output would be actual data. But everything could be represented with this somewhat simple pattern. I actually wound up building an open source project out of this called MediatR to represent this, mainly because it was the same stupid 100 lines of code I would copy over and over and over again. But we represented everything in our system as commands and queries going to sort of a central dispatcher mediator, and then that would be dispatched or mediated to individual handlers. Now that meant that our controllers now became very simple and very uniform. Every single controller action was just delegating off to the actual real work being done and a mediator through the mediator to a handler. But we built individual queries around every single request in our system. And every time you needed to change the system, you were only ever adding new things, not ever changing things. In our previous system where we had all those different layers, every single layer was used by everything else. So we had a lot of merge conflicts and problems dealing with people stepping in each other's code because everyone was always changing the same files. Like, oh, you're changing the person repository, well, I'm changing the person repository. So you get the repository bunny because only you can change the repository now. And once you're done, you give me the bunny back because I want to make sure I don't want to have those kind of merge conflicts. In this mode, because all the code behind a handler was only in that one handler, it wasn't shared anywhere else, we didn't have to worry about stepping in each other's toes. Additionally, I went one step further and said, we're not going to put any of those abstractions in either. So no repositories, no services, nothing like that. Put all the code in the handler and make it as dumb as possible. Just like, do the most procedural, simple thing you could possibly do. And if it gets more complicated, then you can start to extract that out into whatever refactoring you want to do there. But just make it absolutely as dumb as possible. But no more abstractions, no more hiding the ORM or whatever we're using behind a repository. Just use the things directly, and if this ever becomes a problem in the future, we'll move away from it. But that was 7 or 8 years ago, and still we haven't seen a problem with this sort of approach. The next thing we did that was somewhat interesting is we saw that when we were changing the application, we would have to go a lot of different places in the architectures. Even though we weren't doing a layered architecture, we still organize everything by kind or type. So models were in one place, views were another, and they were kind of all over the place. So we went one step further. We said, how about instead of organizing everything by type or by kind, how about everything that changes together lives together? So that meant we started organizing everything by feature as opposed to by type. And when I looked at an individual feature in the application, this thing that does a group of things, then everything related to that feature lived together too. So handlers, the query objects, the command objects, the validators, the views, any JavaScript associated with it, everything I needed to understand how a feature worked, they all lived right next to each other in the code base. So as a new developer coming onto the system, if I want to know how some screen works, I can go to one spot and see everything associated with how that screen comes together. If I want to change code or add new code, well, typically we were only adding new code in this code base. And when I'm making a change to the system, I'm almost always adding new code, adding new files, and not modifying anything else, which is somewhat liberating to know that you can make a change in the system and not worry about affecting anyone else or anything else or any other part of the application. It didn't mean that we had to do a lot of finagling and work to get the actual runtime to be able to handle this kind of structure, but for us as developers, it was just a sort of breath of fresh air to know that I can go to one spot and see everything related to that feature and know that that one set of features will not be related to anything else in the system, and it's very localized. So that was our fourth lesson, which was to don't blindly follow pattern advice. Well, the corollary of CQRS is quite lovely, so I would I usually start with that because it's a nice pattern to put in. But don't start with these horribly complicated project templates with all these things you need to structure to make to go together. Do the simplest thing that could possibly work and then iterate over that design over time. I'll end with how we dealt with others. So we decided to build this one system and we built the wall around it. Yes, we built the wall. But we still had to worry about the other people that would use this application. So for each individual set of users and how they would use our application, we, for each group, decided at that point in time what is the best way that we will integrate and interact with those different people. So for the law enforcement agency, we looked at what do they actually do in real life? How do they actually interact with the prosecution department in person? This is what they did. About twice a day, those forms that are filled out in triplicate, one of the forms, they'd bundle them up and literally drop them on the front desk of the prosecution department, and they would walk away. So we built a portal to do so, a very thin application that wasn't connected to the rest of the system to emulate that kind of interaction that they had today. Now, believe it or not, police officers can be a bit lazy. Shocker, I know. And so they actually preferred to do the paper approach because it was the least work for them, but the most work for the clerks because they had to go type everything in themselves and literally spend all day doing this. So we did a little hack for them. We reduced the number of queues for manual paper to 1, and then installed a series of a half a dozen kiosks that they come in and use the system. So they would come in and see, ooh, there's a long queue to drop my papers off because they're checking every one now, but there's no one over at the queue to type it in, so I'll go over there instead. A little bit of a trick, but it works sometimes. The defense attorneys, they were quite a bit different. Defense attorneys do need some more information, but we also saw that defense attorneys tend to aren't necessarily confined to single prosecution agencies. They'll travel around and try cases all over the state of Texas. So for them, we actually built a completely separate portal that was not a portal inside of the overall prosecution system. They would have to log into umpteen different prosecution systems. We built a completely separate portal that communicated via an actual REST API, Hyper-Media and all, and that was what the portal communicated with. We did similar things for the indigent defense and the courts, build these overall targeted systems, building interactions to match what closely matches the interactions they have in real life. And then from that, we stopped getting people cursing at us with the system. So that was my fifth lesson. Microservices and, as a corollary, anti-corruption layers are your friend. You should actually do them. You should actually take a look. Building things around these bounded contexts using microservices results in an overall much better system at the end. So, final tally. This was still a large application. I might break it down more if I had yet another go, but honestly, I'm tired of the legal process. It's really quite dull. Too many acronyms and forms and junk. It's just really dull. So the final tally here, many fewer controllers, still 70, that's a lot. We had almost equivalent number of actions, 600. The reason we had a lot of actions is because we were able to build a much more targeted focused system so we could build very targeted user interactions. A lot of permissions, a lot of entities, no value objects because those aren't actually a thing in SQL, so we stopped doing them. And as of the time I looked last, we had about 30 counties deployed, so again, another success. Then the joke we had here was that with all the stuff that Eric Evans said he would remove from the book if he had to do it over again, it reminded me of another picture where we had JavaScript and JavaScript the good parts. A much smaller thing. Well, you could say the similar thing for the DDD book. If you took all of the good parts out of the DDD book and made them its own book, you'd actually just have the Building Microservices book. So I actually recommend that if you want to learn DDD over the Big Blue book anymore. So that was the DDD do-over. My name is Jimmy Bogard. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. So we did have some questions, which y'all can go at. So one question is, do you agree with that tactical patterns are mostly causing problems because we don't focus on behavior but telling which pattern we should use for that thing? Absolutely. I see a lot of the design patterns, the structural ones, are really missing language features. So if we looked at how the system would be built in a functional language, for example, it would be a lot cleaner without a lot of the patterns. And in fact, I think most of my open source projects are just missing language features. So absolutely. Next one is, when would you want to use an anemic model? When the domain is anemic, I guess. A lot of times I start with anemia, which we just call it a data model, and when we see behavior start to become incorporated in the system, we push the behavior down into that anemic model, and then it becomes a non-anemic model or regular domain model. But I start anemic until their behavior exists, and I push it down as I go. Next one is, what infrastructure was used for application and domain events? A lot of DI container magic I don't want to do ever again. That's what we had to use. What was the size of the second project compared to the first? I don't know if that's in terms of lines of code, but I can run those numbers and post it on Twitter afterwards. I still actually have the code on this thing. When would one want to use DDD? I would say when the thing you're building represents the core domain of the group you're working with, then it's a good fit. If something you're building is not the core thing they focus on a daily basis, then just build the stupidest application possible, make it the dumbest code possible. What type of database is better for DDD, SQL or NoSQL? Oh, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I won't be able to get to that. No, I'll answer that on Twitter. Actually, the best answer I have for that is the database you have should model the data structures that you have in real life. Don't try to shoehorn in a data structure that doesn't actually match the data structure of the database, but beyond that, you should just use whatever database supports the data structure you want. I don't know what about DDD from your presentation, but it seems mostly related to model the right entities or context. Is it all related to data and not behavior? No, it is related to behavior as well. The reason why we had a lot more actions in our system is because we were able to make our system a lot more behavioral and targeted to the tasks the users are doing. And so we found that when we were in that domain-driven design mindset, using the language, then we were able to really go far in building the system that had the behaviors associated that they wanted. Why did you abandon value objects? Because those aren't a thing in the database we were using. And so we learned that don't try to use things in your database that aren't actually first-class citizens. For example, I also don't recommend using SQL Server as an event store because it's horrible at that. Don't do it. When organizing a feature, I think there should be still a lot of shared code between a few features. We did have shared code. We had the domain model itself was shared, and we did find that there were some times I would have a similar concept between multiple features. We would pull those out, but we were very, very careful about that because pulling things out and making them in one common place introduces coupling between those different features that we may not actually want to have in our system to have that sort of coupling. The last one is, are customers still happy using the system? Well, they stopped cussing at us, so I think that's good. Thank you.